Okay, now that we've mastered the basics of getting images into our pages and integrated with our HTML and our CSS, we really need to talk about images and universal design. There are a few things that you need to do with your images to ensure that they're really accessible to everybody, and you want to really start doing this. Just get into the habit from the very beginning of your coding life. You want to remember when you're working with images that some people can't view images, right? They're interacting with the internet through something like a screen reader that is telling them what's on the page. Also, some people choose not to view images, maybe because of the type of technology they're using to view the internet. Maybe they have to worry about bandwidth or file size, and so images take longer to load, and so they turn off those images, or they just dislike the visual clutter. So what that means is we should be using images appropriately and describing them accurately for those who do not see them. And that does have some ramifications when we think about our coding. So I'm going to show you now how to code images correctly so that they conform with principles of universal design. Okay, so I'm picking up with our file that we've been coding, and now that we've got some images in here, we're actually going to add a little bit more code to make sure that people who can't see these images can understand the purpose and why they're there. So these images that I have embedded in the page are really the ones I need to worry about. The images that are set as CSS backgrounds, those images actually don't bother people who are working with screen readers, because in a lot of cases they just eliminate the CSS style to begin with. So that just gets rid of those images. And those images are what are called decorative images anyway. And so when we have decorative images, we will code them as such, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. But these particular ones that are part of CSS, since they just drop out of the picture anyhow, we actually don't need to worry about them. I mean, that's one reason that when you are using strictly decorative images, it actually can be a good idea to use your CSS to generate them as backgrounds anyway, because then you are doing the right thing in terms of keeping the clutter out of your code, so that it's easy for people who are using screen readers or just not viewing images. It's easy for them to eliminate those images and not even worry about those decorative ones. Okay, but let's talk about our content images, which are these three that are here on the page. So there are a few things we need to do to ensure that we have coded these properly for people who can't see them. One of them is that we want to add a description of each of these images. And there's a very simple way to do it. We just use the Alt property in our HTML, and Alt just allows us to provide a textual description of an image so that would be read out loud by a screen reader. So in this case, I've gotten these images from a website called Illustrated Shakespeare, and they're all paintings of different Richard III's from different painters over time. So for example, this one here is this image. This one is the first image on the page. And so a nice alt tag would be to give the painter the title of the image and the date. So that actually is a really great thing we can just grab and put into our alt tag. So if I go back here, so if we just go back to our code and take a look, so here we are in our image line. I accidentally put the alt tag in the wrong place for a second there. And we just want to use ALT equals, and then quotation marks. And when we reload our page, it looks exactly the same, but let me just show you what would happen. Let's just say this image were not available. Let's say I put a typo in the title here, so it's not going to load that image. Again, this is just for the purposes of demonstrating how this alt tag functions. It's not something I recommend you doing in a real site. Okay, so notice what happens. The image can't be displayed now, but the alt tag that we typed in there, or that we pasted in there, is displaying. And that's exactly what you want. You want to have that as a substitution for the image when the image is not available or someone chooses not to display it. So that's what we want to do with our alt tags. It's also a great way to give credit for the images that you use, and you should definitely do that. Best practice, make sure you're keeping track of where those images are coming from, and this is a great way to credit those images. So we would want to do that for all of the images on our page. We'd want to put in those alt tags. Now, the other thing that you really should do, again, as a best practice, is indicate the size of your image. So you can use height and width dimensions within your IMG tag, height and width properties within that, to indicate what the height and width are. Now, technically speaking, you can also use those to change what the height and width are, but remember, we don't want to do that through our HTML coding. We want to do that, if we have to do it, we want to do it through CSS coding, and ideally, we should just make our images the right size to begin with. So what we really want to do here is find out, well, what is my image size that I'm working with? So remember, this image is called R301. It's in our images folder. And if you just hover over, if you just go to your File Explorer, you just hover over it, you can get the dimensions, right? The 156 by 250, and width is always listed before height when we're looking at these dimensions. All we'd want to do is just make a note of that, 156 by 250, and then just go ahead into our HTML code and do 156. And remember, it does have to be in quotation marks when we're doing it in the HTML code, not when we're doing in the CSS. So when you're trying to do a pixel dimension, you just do the number itself, and that assumes pixels. If you wanted to do a percentage, and again, that'd be if you were trying to size it, then you would do a percentage. But again, we're not trying to size it here. We're just trying to make it clear to a user what the width and height are. So it's not going to change the image at all. It's just declaring what the width and height are. And again, when you reload in the browser, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't change the image at all because we're using the exact dimensions that it is. But it's making it more user-friendly for our user. And it is reserving that amount of space for that image if in fact it doesn't display. So once again, I'll do my demonstration trick here, and then notice what happens. It maintains the space on the page where the image would be, and then it puts the alt tag in where the image would be. So in the ideal world, this is what we want to happen on our page when the image can't render or when someone chooses to have it not render, is it should still maintain the width and height, the space that the image would typically take up, and it should have an accurate description of what that image is. Remember, I mentioned that you could have a content image within your page that is a decorative image. If it really is strictly a decorative image, then the alt description that you should use for it is exactly those words, decorative image. And again, you want to try to do this as little as possible. If you're using images on the page, they should be substantive in some way. And this one, in this case, we really should be using the description here that's accurate, that credits the artist of the painting, right? So that would actually be the better alt tag in this case. But again, if it really were strictly a decorative image, you can just indicate that, and then decorative image is what you should put in as your alt tag. So those are the two basic things we want to remember when we're using images in our page, in our HTML pages. We want to remember to put in our alt tags all the time, and we want to remember to indicate the width and height of our images. That information you can get very easily from your File Explorer just by hovering over the image and getting the dimensions right there. And if for some reason that doesn't turn up, you can also look at the properties of that particular file. You go to the details, it will show the dimensions there as well, and it will even explicitly tell you which one is width and height. It'll even tell you things like resolution. And then let me just leave you with a few best practices in addition to what we've learned about how to encode the images correctly in our HTML. So first of all, don't turn text into an image. What I mean by that, it can be very tempting to use some kind of image editor to create something that has a text of a title of a page or something to make it really fancy. You don't have to do that. There are really great ways to get some fancy fonts and to use image backgrounds in CSS that can create that fancy banner effect without rendering the text itself as an image. So then that keeps the text readable, which is ultimately what we want. So I'll just let me show you a quick example of that. So when you're taking a look at something that looks like the text is actually an image, there's a really easy way to figure out whether or not it is. One is just to try to select it. If you can select it letter by letter, like this one, then you know this is actually text. It is not a single image. And the other way is if you resize and you see that it actually changes the break as it does here, then again, you know that it is text and not an image. So even though this looks very much like an image, it's not. It's just text. It's just text that actually has a fancy font. And we're going to get into fancy fonts in the next module. But just remember that your text should be text, And again, so that people can still interact with it as text and it's readable as text, for example, with a screen reader. So make sure your text is text and not an image. And then use the appropriate format for your image files. So if you're using something that's photo-like, that type of an image, that should be a JPEG. And if you've got something that's more like a line drawing or solid, sort of color blocks, simpler images, that should be a GIF. And I know that there, for some reason that I just do not understand, some big debate over whether that is said GIF or GIF. It is definitely GIF, because what it stands for is graphics interchange format. Graphics, hard G, definitely GIF. Just had to get that in there. Okay, so use a GIF for line drawings. And if you've got something that has an alpha channel, or in other words, has a transparency, when you put that image on a background, the background can show through. So it has transparency around it or behind it, or it itself is not fully opaque, that you would have to use a PNG to get that transparency. Make sure you're using the appropriate format for your images as well. Those are just some best practices. And again, just remember, when we're thinking universal design, we want everyone to be able to have the best experience with our web design.